Hello and welcome to RIVE, Reflections in Veterinary Education. It's a journal club episode, and Eric has selected a journal for us for this time around. Do you want to take it over and tell us what you chose and
Yeah,
why?
yes. The transition from letter grading to modified pass-fail grading at a College of Veterinary Medicine, a narrative inquiry of student experiences by Walker, Posner, Nelson, and Watson. As I often do for Journal Club for my anesthesia residents, I just go to PubMed and type in dog anesthesia and kind of see what comes up,
Yep.
or cat anesthesia or horse anesthesia. So, in the same kind of way, I just went to JVME. I'm just browsing, just see, what kinds of things have been published lately, what looks interesting. And this caught my eye for two reasons. One, the transition piece of the
Yeah.
title. I'm like, okay, cool. Like that, they're describing what that process was of that movement, which I thought was neat. And then pass fail, I'm pretty sure we've talked about here before. I don't know if we've covered it as a topic. And I do want to make sure that we get to the article. So I don't want to. What I would propose is, like, I'll go through the introduction and then we can digest that and sort of talk about that, and then like kind of go through the methods and talk about that as we go. How's that sound?
Sounds
Sure.
good.
Okay, so this is at North Carolina State University, and of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, they had to transition their whole curriculum, like all of the rest of us, and they were worried about the impact on mental health and well-being, and so they decided to implement an across-the-board change from their letter grade, A through F, to a modified pass-fail system. So need to describe this MPF system because it's a little bit different maybe than a lot of others. So uh, NCSU apparently has plus and minus grades in the D range, which was new to me. My historical experience is you either do whole letter grades, A, B, C, D, F, or A minus, B plus minus, C plus minus, D, F. So I was curious if you guys have encountered that. I'm already breaking my rule of waiting to the end of the introduction, but I just like, have you guys encountered that before of a plus minus D system?
No.
Not an only plus minus D system, like that
Yeah.
was kind of interesting
I
for
I
the,
think that they had plus minus of the other letter grades as well. I'm not
oh, okay.
sure about that, but I think
Okay.
that's the case.
Okay. That makes a
Um,
little more sense. But I have not in veterinary schools, but like I have in other scenarios seen that. Um, but yeah, I think mostly in college and like, post grad stuff, like no, like the half grades weren't really sticking around much.
yeah. So that led, because they have that system, culturally, that led them to this MPF system where a satisfactory is basically an A through C, a marginal is equivalent to any of the D grades, and then an unsatisfactory would be equivalent to an F grade. Um,
So I actually had a question about that.
yeah.
Do you want me to hold that or?
No, 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 go ahead.
Okay. Because my question was then, do the D still pass? Because when I went through college and when I went through vet school, we had an A through F grading system. But D's, I mean, they were passing, but you still had to remediate them. And if you didn't get at least a C, then you
Hmm.
were essentially basically a failure. And so like you could get I think it was two Fs before you were kicked out, but you could only get three Ds before you were kicked out. So they were still essentially sort of like failing grades. So that wasn't clear to me in this. So do you all know
I
or?
agree it wasn't clear in this. What I've seen other places where you can get a D and you do pass, but your cumulative GPA or so I don't know how they did that with this system because you don't have a GPA. So like if you had a bunch of A's and one D and your cumulative GPA was above a C average, you were okay.
Okay.
So I'm not sure how. My guess is that's kind of the system they had for when it was still D's, but I don't know what the marginal means.
Yeah,
If
because if it said it was a marginal pass, so it's like,
I think it's a pass.
could you potentially get marginal passes in all your classes and still pass? I
That I
mean,
don't know. Yeah.
I what I yeah, I it's speculative on my part as well. what I would, if I was designing this system, I would say if you get a marginal pass one semester, then you're on academic probation the next semester.
Yeah.
You can't get a second below pass grade.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I
Um,
think my guess is it's something like that as well, that it's a way to flat, because I think that's the whole point of having the marginal, right? We're saying you didn't fail, but we want to identify the students who are maybe borderline and we want to provide them with additional support, or maybe there is an opportunity to remediate. So I think that's why they kept it, because I think that's my reading of this, and maybe I read too much into it, but that was what the Ds were for, was to identify those students who you're going to move along, but we need to flag these students down so we can provide them extra resources, or, you know, just alert them like, hey, this can't continue. And I think the marginal was meant to be a continuation of that.
That makes sense in my head. It definitely wasn't.
I agree, though.
it was not clear.
Explicit.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. So, so the MPF impact, it didn't contribute to their GPA calculation, and that then led to an inability to calculate class rank. They had an interesting observation, which is that their experience is that class rank is often within a very narrow range, so that small differences in class outcome can have sort of outsized impacts on the class rank, which you know, especially with grade inflation, makes a lot of sense to me. Like we were talking about, like, there was some school where like half of their students had above a 3.9, you know, GPA or
like
something
the standard
ridiculous.
deviations are just so tiny that, like,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, I know when we're calculating class rank, it's getting down to like the hundredths point in percentage, like between two. It's
stupid.
Yes, that is.
And that'll come up in the results. So they implemented MPF grading throughout the peak of the pandemic, which was fall 2020, spring 21. And then in fall of 21, they could assume their previous grading policies, and 14 out of 24 of the core rotations did so. So then in fall of 21, the first year class matriculated, they were graded on an MPF scale. As it happened, all of the course leaders chose to retain MPF. So the freshmen came in, unbeknownst to them, they're all getting graded MPF. The second year class, they had only had MPF during the pandemic, and now they're experiencing a mixture of letter grading and MPF grading in some courses. And the third year class had experienced letter grading, went into MPF grading, and now was going back to sort of a mixture. So I thought that was interesting. You know, it's like a natural experiment, right? But we have these three sort of conditions that all have these different experiences and these different exposures to different experimental conditions before we have sort of the study start, which I thought was kind of neat.
Yeah. It does create a sort of natural experiment. The one thing that I sort of found fascinating, just in my head, and, you know, talking about it in the introduction, is that it was the pandemic that spurred this. And like, I guess I would have liked a little bit more in depth of like why? What's so unique about this, right? Like, we all just make assumptions. Oh, it's a pandemic. Yeah, we're going to change things up. But it's like, what difference did that really make? And my assumptions and kind of reading between the lines were, you know, anxiety, stress, which I think they said some of that explicitly. But they
did mention their concerns about the sensitivity of assessments to differentiate knowledge. And having taught during the pandemic, you know, I think we all appreciate, like, we just put together assessments, like, to have assessments. And it's like, I don't know if those were necessarily effective in documenting, was this a good student or not?
But I just think it's funny that we think when it wasn't the pandemic, we were doing a good job.
Well, exactly. I mean, I mean, I would argue that we weren't necessarily doing a great job of that before the pandemic.
That's a great point.
That's my point. That was my point. It was like, yeah, maybe like this was the first time we actually reflected and said, I wonder if we're actually doing a good job with this. And then, but we didn't go back and think, have we ever done a good, like, what's our evidence that what we were doing before was working, like that our teaching was good? Like, so I think we all felt like it was hard, blah, 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 but it was like, I'm not sure we know. So anyway, that was what stuck out to me. It was like, we're assuming that this is going to be bad, or there's going to be trouble. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's also just we're just shooting in the dark all the time anyway. So
Yeah, I mean, I also found it really interesting that they gave faculty members the choice to return to non-pass fail grading, to that letter grading. It just seemed, and I think that's borne out as we talk about the discussion and the actual findings, and you go into it, Eric, but it just seemed very, it would be very difficult for me as a student to navigate that in a way that made sense. And again, I think that's borne out in what they found here. So, but
I also think, yeah, I
yeah,
100% agree. And I wonder if it was like, hey, do this temporarily. And what people don't like change. And
yeah,
one thing I've learned, because I love change, I'm like a huge, like, let's just change for fun. And people don't like that. And what I've learned is if I tell people, okay, we're going to do this for this period of time, and then we're going to reassess. And if we don't like it, and I wonder if that was part of the deal to say, look, this is
yeah,
this temporary. And if you hate it, we'll go back. But that also gives them an opportunity to, sometimes we put on our rose-colored glasses and we're like, it was so much better before. And then they go back again and they're like, maybe it wasn't that much different. Like maybe that's also an opportunity to say, hey, we give you the option. And then later we can be like,
true.
there wasn't really much evidence. So I wonder if that was more of a people handling kind of a thing.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know.
And that what that puts in mind for me is adopting that strategy generally for changes to be like, this isn't for forever.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we try it out for a semester or a couple semesters and see? And then at the end, if you want to go back, you can.
Yeah.
That might be a way to kind of sweeten, because yeah, faculty are notoriously resistant to change.
Yeah. I've tried that in certain things. I'm like, here's the deal. I want to try this, but I want you to give it, like, I want you to be serious about it and really try, but we're going to reevaluate it at this point. And then if we come together and go, that was a failed experiment, then we'll go back to how it was. And that's fine. That's kind of, I've learned, for me as somebody who likes change, I've learned, like, that's obvious. Like, of course, if it doesn't work, we're not going to keep doing it. That's silly. But for people who are afraid of change or really resistant to it, stating that explicitly sometimes helps them say, okay, I'm willing to give this a try. So that's something I've started using. And that's what made me think of that. They were like, I'll make you a deal. If you do this for me, we can go back. I don't know.
I think it's also a good way to get people to really actually assess it, right? Because there's a saying, I spent 10 years in the Army, and there's a saying in the Army that the very best job that you've ever had is either the job you just left or the job you're getting ready to go to. And so if you have the opportunity to do something, change it for a short period of time, and then go back, you might be like, oh, maybe this wasn't as great as I thought it was. So maybe that was like you said, it was just like giving them a little bit of agency and figuring things out. But anyway, it was just interesting.
Cool. Yeah.
Good stuff.
So then they go into a little bit of a discussion about pass fail, the comparison with letter grading. And I think, we should be reasonably familiar with this, but just really superficially, concerns about changing to pass fail is you eliminate GPA and class rank for sort of internship residency purposes. But then letter grades have a number of adverse consequences, in terms of collaboration, students incentivizing their performance, experiencing stress, etc. And then they do a brief literature search or summary about medical schools and veterinary schools. So pass fail, less perceived stress, greater group cohesion, reduced burnout, improved student well-being without, importantly, reduced academic performance. And this has been found time and time again. This is not a novel finding. What was new to me was I knew that medical schools had been doing this for quite some time. But in the introduction, I think they mentioned that this started in the 1960s. So normally I say veterinary medicine is like 20 years behind, and now it looks like we're a solid 60 years behind. So go team.
Got to hold on to certain things. Very resistant to change,
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
The one thing that they didn't mention, and probably because there's not really literature on this, but I also think letter grades give us this false sense that we know what that means, right?
Yeah.
And that there's some comparison there. And this will probably come up more when we talk about like the internships, residencies, right? Like we have this idea that a C at Georgia means the same as one at Minnesota, means the same. One, I don't think that's true. We also know grade inflation, which is why class rank is often included to try to provide that perspective. But as you already said earlier, Eric, like, that's really not telling you. It's just thumbs down. But
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things for me is that it really focuses the student on the outcome instead of the process.
mhm,
And in vet school, we really want our students to focus on the process, right? So I was actually having a conversation with a student who just took one of your classes, Dr. Connor, and she was talking about how much she really enjoyed the
okay.
writing process and how
Yeah.
much she really enjoyed that you explained to them, this is how I'm going to grade you. So, some of you are going to do a really great job. You're going to get all the things. That's going to be it. Great. You passed with flying colors. Some of you are going to get most of it right, but not all of it right. And you're going to be a pass. And there are some things that you need to improve. Some of you are going to get a little bit less of it. But she was telling me, it just made me feel better because I knew that I was going to get credit for the thinking I did that was right. And I was going to be told what I needed to think about further where I went wrong. And so then it kind of led to this discussion about like, gosh, I wish math had been that way. I think I would have been better at math if I'd had instructors who, when I was doing those ridiculous geometry proofs, had looked through the whole proof and said, oh, here's where you went wrong. I'm going to give you 50% credit instead of going to the very end and saying you put in a negative instead of a positive, you don't get any credit. But that wasn't helpful. So I think that's one of the things that letter grades also do is give you an inflated sense of how good of a veterinarian you're going to be. And it literally has nothing to do with how good of a veterinarian you're going to be. It has none.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to know. At least one of my students likes the process and was getting it. Was like, yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's hard. I do a lot of that, and it's so different. And this came up
Yeah.
in this article as well about. I think one of the comments I like, one of the students, like, we spent all of our years of school plus our undergrad, like grades, grades, grades.
Yep.
This is a shift, and it is
Yeah.
an adjustment. And so some
Yeah.
of them get to my course and they're like, what? No,
Yep.
what's the
What's
answer? And I'm
happening?
like,
Yeah.
I don't, there isn't an answer.
Yeah.
What is your thought process? And they're like,
Yeah.
we don't
Yeah.
understand. I'm like,
Yeah.
I know, but you'll get there. Maybe a few years down the road, you'll look back.
So I thought this line was nice. A little shade at veterinary medicine. The shift away from letter grades in medical education should no longer be considered an experiment, but a dominant trend. I'm like, yeah, come on, vet med, like do better.
That is a nice little dig. I
Yep.
like it.
I mean, I think I would say to that though, really quickly, that yes, but it needs to be done right. And I will say, I mean, I'm going to throw some shade at Virginia, Maryland. They don't do it right. They
I-
they do it wrong, right? Like they still calculate a class rank, so you don't really
Yep.
have a true pass fail.
Oh,
Yep.
true.
Yep. I know. It's
Yeah.
really frustrating.
Yeah.
Because the
Yeah,
students,
thumbs
I'm like,
down.
you've done all of the things for pass fail, and then you kept that in. I've been
Yeah.
doing that for years too.
Exactly.
Like, just delete that. Just
Yep.
we don't know. You
Yeah.
passed. Good job.
Yep. So they wanted to capture the perspectives of veterinary students on MPF grading during a transition. And again, that's what I've kind of focused on from the title was capturing this transitional period, which I thought would be neat. And especially students experiencing at different points in their educational process. Okay, so introduction. Any other comments, thoughts, ideas on that?
Nope.
Cool.
I think that's good.
Okay, so methods, and yeah, I think we'll just kind of pick it apart as we go. So all students in the first 3 years were invited to a electronic survey. Surveying consisted of 7 open-ended text questions. And just a real interesting note, like I can tell that this figure was made in Microsoft Paint, like the old version of Paint too, because like this is how I do things, and it's all like the blocky, like you can see the pixels kind of thing. Anyways,
That's awesome.
um,
Hmm.
so the questions are how has the change to MPF grading affected your expectations around the quality of instruction you receive, how you value different courses, the effort you put into studying. So that's kind of the academic piece. And then they had a well-being piece, your interactions with your classmates, your sense of well-being, your willingness to pursue work, leisure, or enrichment activities. That was all sort of well-being, sort of mental health stuff. And then there was a question about your plans for post DVM training. So they did not do, in my opinion, a particularly good job of describing how they came up with these questions. And then I didn't see any description of pilot testing, which has kind of become my latest hobby horse, because I just see so many surveys where I'm like, I know that you know what this means,
Mhm.
and I know what this means, but the average respondent to this survey may or may not know what
Yep.
Yeah.
this means.
Yep.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
agree. And having Eric, we collaborated on a survey study where we
Oh
did go through
yeah.
that. In fact, I think I gave the survey to you, Catherine, as a pilot. Like, and we did, and with several other people, like, hey, what does this mean? And we made a lot of adjustments there. And even with that, after we get that, so we're like,
Yeah.
dang it, this wasn't quite clear. Like, even doing those steps, you miss some things. And so, like, if you haven't done those steps, how much more, kind of confusion, and are people answering not quite the question that you meant them to? So, yep, I agree. I think there could have been a lot more description of their process and like why they chose this. And again, yep,
Yeah.
got a
I think,
rate
I mean, there are literally whole classes on survey
survey
design.
design.
And I
We'll take
think
one.
much like multiple choice questions, lots of people think, oh, I can put a survey together. That's not hard. And then you do them and you're like, oh, well, that was totally not what I expected people to respond to that question like. Or, I mean, I've certainly done my fair share of even interview questions, which are a form of survey.
Mhm.
And I have, questions on there, and then I'm getting into the interviews and I'm like, oh, well, you just answered that question. Oh, okay. Well, that answered
Yeah.
that question. I guess I don't need to answer, so yeah, it would have been nice to have a little bit more information about that for sure.
And you're
Yeah.
never going to get it perfect, right? Like
No, no,
Right.
no, no.
Right.
but
No.
going through that
But
process
again,
is
describing the process.
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yep, would have been
Um,
great.
they also didn't describe, as far as I can tell, the distribution method. Like, I assume this was sent to their student listserv, um, but they didn't say how it was distributed. They didn't say if there were any
Follow-up.
follow-ups or anything
Mhm.
like that. And
Yeah.
especially, when one of the ideas that I think about with survey design is like cognitive load. And whenever you're asking an open-ended question, that is a high cognitive load question.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
you're putting 7 open-ended questions that are all high cognitive load.
Yeah.
Like that, that's a big ask,
That's a
in my
lot. Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah,
Agreed.
I feel like, yeah. So I did take I took a survey and questionnaire and survey design course for my
Oh,
master's
cool.
last semester or the semester before that, I can't remember. And yeah, I mean, that was a big piece of it. Eric was like going through and thinking, okay, one, it's, and maybe they did this, but like giving somebody an estimation, how long is this going to take you?
Yeah.
Those kinds of things. And a little bit more about that would have been helpful, but I agree. 7 open-ended questions is a lot. Because and they're weighty questions. They're, sometimes open-ended questions are like boom, boom, boom. That's pretty simple. But these weren't that. And at first I was like, oh, that's not a very good response rate. But then when I thought more about it, I'm like, actually, that's kind of
That's pretty
impressive
good.
that many students did respond.
Yeah.
So yes, I think a more description of the, how they created the survey, the recruitment process, what was the follow-up. I don't remember, did they say that? I don't think there were any incentives, but I'm not sure they said that one way or the other for sure. I don't remember now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they didn't mention, so I assume no.
Did they say how long it was available
I
too?
don't think so.
Yeah.
Don't think so.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm gonna turn my light on so I can
Yeah.
see.
And then at the end of it, they asked people to participate in a follow-up interview.
Mhm.
Something that I did appreciate is they mentioned their theory. I think that my expectation with educational research papers is that I think I want at least a paragraph about the theory in the introduction.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Just
I
agree.
would
so that
agree.
as the reader, I know about, because I was not familiar with this one, which is always exciting to me. I love encountering new theories because I'm like, oh, this is cool. I haven't heard of this.
Yeah.
So they used expectancy value theory, where motivation is driven by the person's belief about their chances of success,
Mhm.
which is the expectancy, and then the perceived value of achieving a goal or
Mhm.
task.
Yeah.
So I appreciated that they included the theory. The theory makes sense in the context of their work, which I think is also very cool. I would have liked to know a little bit more about it.
Yeah,
I
I think I agree. I think it's also so one of the things that I do when I'm asked to review a qualitative paper is, I don't want you to tell me that you used this approach. I want you to tell me the approach and then explain it. And they did not do a good job of explaining narrative inquiry, because narrative inquiry is like there's a lot to it. And I'm not expecting them to do an entire paper on it, but certainly a small paragraph about
Yeah.
what narrative inquiry does, why they selected this particular technique to approach this data, and how enriched the actual findings would have also been nice. Now,
I
that
think,
said, we're asking them to add a lot more into the paper, and I think this is JVME, and I don't think JVME has a word count limit, but depending on what the situation might be, there are sometimes word count limits, but
yeah.
yeah, that would have been nice.
I think for me though, one thing I often see in these types of papers in veterinary medicine is they are written like a typical veterinary research article, where it's like a brief introduction
Yeah.
into your methods, then give me the rules, and a long discussion. And
Yeah.
several years ago, I can't remember exactly who I was working with, who was like, we flip-flop that in this. It's like a super long introduction. That's all of your background, talking about the theory, going on, like that's your literature review, telling me everything that's going to happen. And then the rest of it is a little briefer.
Yep, exactly.
And so I think we're still keeping that more traditional research format in the paper, where you want to keep the introduction, but just tell me a little bit about it, and then we'll get to it. And so I think that's what's missing here, and why I think we're all like, oh, but I wanted more. That different style, and this type of research lends itself well, exactly as you said, Eric. I think it would have been really nice to like. I would have actually wanted more than just a little paragraph. I'd be like, give me some literature review, like talk to me a little bit about it. But that's not what the readership is used to. That's probably not what a lot of the reviewers are used to. So I think that will probably take time for us to really see that change. I don't know.
Yeah.
I do agree with that. I think that when I read like true social science papers that are written for social scientists, I'm like, oh, for God's sake, just let's get to the methods. Like I think there's a balance. I think that we bring something as biomedical researchers to that discussion.
That's fair. Yeah.
Because I would like a little more of a balance personally.
Yeah, which is fair. But I think you're right. I want to give them some kudos for bringing theory into it, because we oftentimes see studies like this and it's never mentioned at all. So, so I get
and quite frankly, you should not see a study like this that doesn't mention theory.
Right.
And if it does, then it didn't get the kind of review that it really should have gotten.
Yep.
So.
Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. So then they had 18 volunteers, or students who were willing to do the follow-up interview. Then they had 7 students actually participate, encompassing all 3 class cohorts. So the survey responses, they collated and categorized using constant comparative method, which again was a new one on me, which again, I love learning about new methods. I think I would need to sit with this a little bit more than the brief overview that I was able to find online, because it seems like it's used in grounded theory, where they're trying to create a theory, and comparing the data with emerging categories. So you kind of come up with a category, and then future data you compare back, and it's like, is this not like, come up with more. I don't know if any of you have used this before, if you can add to that.
I haven't used constant comparative method. I've read about it. That's pretty much all I can say.
Fair.
I mean, I feel like in the end, most qualitative studies are really using thematic analysis at some level, right? And I don't know that they necessarily overtly acknowledge that in here, but they do talk about 7 themes that were identified. So
I was going to say, they found themes. They talked about that. But I don't know enough about constant comparative to know if that is like a subset or how that,
I have a textbook somewhere that has that information in it, but I've never used it, so.
Fair. So then they had their interviews, where they had questions informed from the survey. I don't think I see those questions anywhere in the paper. It would have been nice to have those as a supplement.
Yeah, the interview questions.
Yeah. Just so you know, like, this is a thing that I'm always harping on as a reviewer, is like, I can't replicate this, like I need a higher level of detail that I'm getting.
Yeah.
And that can be in an appendix, that like, it doesn't have to be
right.
just provide it. Yep. Agreed.
Yeah. So they recorded the videos, transcribed them, and then they were analyzed by a individual that was not involved in the interview process, which I thought was interesting, maybe a little bit different than my conception. I think that I usually have the people that were involved participating in the data analysis. I don't know if that's best practice or not. Do you think it makes a difference, Catherine?
No, I don't necessarily think it does. I think part of it was that they were trying to sort of nod to the quantitative, trying to be very
Yeah,
much, researchers, they're the subjects, and sort of that
There's some
lack of bias.
objectivity
But
or something, yeah.
yeah, I mean, but that's one of the things that I also have a tendency to have to comment on. It's like, listen, that qualitative research is inherently biased. No matter what you
right,
do, it's always going to have
right,
bias in it. You can do the best you can, it's always going to have bias. The thing that differentiates, and I mean, one of the things that differentiates qualitative from quantitative is that we embrace that bias and we say
right,
up front, we're biased and these are the biases that we bring to the paper. And that's one of the things that these authors did not do, is sort of give us a little bit of like, this
What
is
are our
who
biases?
we are, these are our perceptions and these are our biases that we bring to this, although we did the best we could to try to interpret it. And so I mean, I don't, it's not necessarily a bad practice to do that, but if you're trying to do it to get rid of bias, it's useless. I mean, it's really not particularly helpful.
No, but it would have been nice, exactly like a reflexivity statement from all the
Yeah.
authors, including, okay, this is who was interpreting the interviews and this was who was
right.
reviewing the surveys, so that we can understand what, tell me what your biases are, what
Yeah.
what you think they are. So I agree. That was one thing I thought was missing for the quality, like just, yeah,
Yeah.
acknowledge the
Yeah.
biases, tell me what they are. It's one of my favorite things about qualitative research, is that they're like, yeah, we own it. And where everyone else is like, no,
Yeah.
no, no, we're super objective. It was like,
You
Yep.
no,
really?
you're not.
So they did thematic analysis. Something that I noticed once they were analyzed, the content was synthesized into 15 themes that appeared most frequently in the interviews.
Yeah.
And that I take a bit of objection to, because sometimes you identify a theme and like only one or two people mention it, but it is really important.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so I think that theme frequency is not necessarily the most useful metric when we're doing thematic analysis. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I agree. And I would say too that it's a quantitative bias again, to want to count things and to categorize them by percentages, which they did. And I'm not saying that you should never use numbers in qualitative, but the fact of the matter is, I've done a number of qualitative papers where themes emerged and they were stated in multiple ways in one single individual's response. And so if you're quantifying it, you're really misrepresenting that in some ways as well. And then, yeah, I think I just recently did something where, I was doing sort of a quick analysis of something, and there was one or two that I was like, oh, wow, like the fact that they're actually mentioning this is really, really important. So I wouldn't necessarily call it a theme,
Yeah.
but you guys need to know this, right?
Yeah.
This has potential impact that could really make a difference. So yeah, that's a long-winded way of saying I agree with you.
This was what I struggled most with this paper. And it's also what I personally struggle most with when I'm doing qualitative research. Like I find myself when I'm writing the themes, and I'll use quantitative terms, even just like frequently. This came up and while I do think there's something to be said for this came up time and time and time again, there's a danger in trying to apply a quantitative analysis to what was never meant to be quantitative. This wasn't a survey with Likert scales and like, tell me this, because it was open-ended.
Yeah.
Because there's also like, yes, there's so much overlap between even the themes that they came up with. And I'm like, did you double count some of those? Because there might be little sections you're like, that could be easily categorized into multiple themes, right? This one little phrase. That often happens when you're coding and that sort of thing. So the quantities I struggled with. Having said that, like I relate to that because I struggle with that like so very much. I'm like, I don't even know how to describe this without using numerical type words. So what I would love to hear, especially, Catherine, with your background, I would love to hear like, when is providing some sort of quantification, like that this was overwhelmingly, like this came up frequently, like, is that ever appropriate? Is that like, how do you do that?
I mean, I definitely think it's appropriate. Like I said, I don't think it's that qualitative people aren't against numbers
Yeah.
and percentages per se. They just try not to be so I guess, discreet about it, right? So you can say the overwhelming number of participants mention this, or, there were 80 participants and there were 350 mentions of this particular thing. I mean, that's appropriate because it does indicate that that's an important thing. When it becomes a problem is when you start quantifying it in a way that says 85% of the participants mention this, because I think that that's very reductionist, and it doesn't give you the opportunity to dig into why did 85% of people mention it. And in those 85% of mentions that you say, were they all the same, or were they sort of different nuanced ways
Yeah.
of approaching a similar theme? And I think that's where the qualitative stuff comes in, and that interpretive
Yeah.
sort of aspect of
Well,
it.
because I struggle with that because I'm like, okay, great, 85% of them went and said this, but it could be that some of them were like, well, yeah, that's fine, but it wasn't really that important. And then somebody
Right.
who didn't say that, if you ask them, hey, why didn't you say this? They're like, oh, that's a good point. I believe that too, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's just sometimes like in the moment. How many times have we had a conversation about anything, and you say certain things, and then later you're like, oh, I wish I'd mentioned that
Yeah.
too. Like that's just a very human thing. And so putting that without being prompted or having some like the quantification just feels very artificial for the
Mhm.
format, and I struggle with it. So
Yeah, I
I
mean, it's
think,
definitely a struggle.
yeah, this is one reason why I personally don't like doing coding. First of all, I don't like doing coding, but second of all, I like doing a gestalt incorporation of the information
Yeah,
because it avoids that counting tendency. And
that's a good point.
sometimes there's like a single quote where I'm like, only one person said this, but man, this is like impactful.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think in an ideal situation where when you have the time and you have the ability to sit down and really focus on doing a qualitative analysis, there is a process, and it may be different for everybody, but for me, for example, the process, if I'm doing interviews, is to actually, I know everybody doesn't want to do sort of the manual transcription, but I like doing that because what it does to me is it forces me to listen to every interview again, right? Because if I'm the one who's doing the interview, I hear it the first time
Yeah.
during the interview. And then the second time when I'm going back through it, I'm listening to what James G would call like big D discourse. I'm listening to everything and thinking back if it was a visual thing too, like, oh gosh, that person said this in this way with this emphasis, and I can hear that now in my head as I'm, hearing that back. And so as I'm transcribing, I'm physically reliving the interview and I'm interpreting it in a way that might be very different than if I was only listening to the little d discourse, which is just the
Yeah.
words, right? And then it really forces me, because I'm slow, I have to really think about it and type it out in a way that gives me an opportunity to go back and reread that again as I'm going through that analysis. And it may be that somebody said, "Oh, that's nice," and somebody else said, "Oh, that's nice," and somebody else said, "Oh, that's nice." And then those are three different things, right? Those are three different ways of saying something that give you a different interpretation of what that person was thinking when they said that. And so in my head, that helps me to not categorize nice as a single phrase that is
Yeah.
descriptive of something, but it is the term combined with sort of the emphasis or the intonation or the inflection that's given. And so in an ideal world, you would have people who have the opportunity to see the entire process through. And then you have somebody maybe who comes in that's either part of the research project or is an outsider, sort of double check that through listening to those interviews, but not necessarily reading the transcriptions right away. So listening to the interviews and then reading the transcriptions and then being like, yeah, that seems very similar, or I heard something a
Yeah.
little bit different. So I think what people often fail to realize about qualitative work, it's a long process. It's
Oh, yeah.
definitely not, when I give workshops about qualitative, I tell people like quantitative is a very linear, very logical process. And so I use this straight line. And when I'm talking about qualitative, it's a circle because it's iterative and there's constant sort of review and gaining new information until you get there. So, um, yeah, I think that's one of the ways that I try to avoid the counting because it helps me
Sense.
go through the process multiple times and think about it in different ways.
Yeah. I like that. I like your thoughts too, Eric, about like maybe coding in and of itself lends itself because we're like, okay, chunk this. We're trying to break things down into little bits and pieces, which just naturally lend themselves to counting,
Yes.
right? And like we had three themes, and we had this like, So I like it's a good thought, and I'm gonna have to think on this some more too. Like, okay, maybe that doesn't always have to be the way we do that, or maybe not that alone. So kind of like what you're
Yeah.
saying, Catherine, like maybe that's not the only way we review the discourse. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Great. So then they did a little bit of a reflexivity paragraph. That's the way that I'm interpreting it, but they didn't provide very much information. They just said who sort of worked with what part of the information. So
Mhm.
they didn't include their sort of philosophical, theoretical approach to the information of the work that I would expect. So I think they tried it, but I
Yeah,
don't think they included as much detail as I would like.
that's a fair call out. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. They do
Um,
they do use a lot of percentages. You know, the
I
large
know.
majority,
yeah.
82% reported no change in their feelings
Yeah.
after graduate. I
Yeah.
mean, and I was like, but
So yeah, so in the
oh,
results, they had 18% response rate. And then they basically used the way I interpret it is they use qualitative methods to get quantitative data and
mhm,
then sort of reinforced it with quotes to tie in the qualitative piece. But
mhm.
yeah, they include like a lot of percentages here. Um, I don't know that I would, I'm not going to summarize the survey results because it's pretty consistent with the interview results. So I think I'm
Yeah.
just gonna like kind of lump
Yeah,
it all together. If that's
I
okay.
like that. And I like the interview. Like I liked that piece of it
Yep.
better.
yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Agreed. So they had 7 themes identified from the interview transcripts and the survey data. So there's an implication that they did something with the survey data interacting with the interview data. I don't think that I fully picked that out in the methods, but anyways. So the first one was impressions of the college learning environment, and the general impression was that it was a more positive learning environment, and not having class rank and the source of stress is good. More collaborative interactions, like all the positive stuff that we kind of know comes with pass fail. They mentioned this was interesting, student perceptions of instructor impact, which I had not thought of at all, but this is one reason why I personally prefer pass fail or specifications grading, is it reduces that antagonism with the student and the instructor. And that's exactly what their theme was, that allowed students to focus on teaching, um, that they wouldn't have to worry about minutia, better student instructor relationships, less animosity. So I was impressed that the students identified that. I
Mhm.
was not expecting that.
Yeah. Less
Yeah.
grade grubbing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Essentially. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think a lot of the students recognize, my impression is that it is a smallish percentage of students who really worry about those numbers, even when you have letter grades. But they're just so persistent that
It's an
it
80,
seems,
I think it's an 80-20 principle, right?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the
Um,
80% are like, no, 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 we like, we're okay. We're
Yeah.
okay. Don't
yep.
lump us in.
Yeah. And then experience of letter and MPF grades in a single semester. So
Yeah.
the second and third year students had some classes that were MPF, some classes that were traditional letter grade. And so they were anxious about that those few classes that had letter grades would unbalance their GPA and have more impact of that. They vehemently disliked that. I seem to recall, I don't know if we talked about it, but there was a paper from I think it was from Washington, where they also had mixed letter and pass fail courses, where that was a concern, but it was not realized.
Mm.
So it turned out that the students, actually did distribute their work equally, but nonetheless, that is a concern with you have mixed pass fail and
Can
graded
I ask a
courses.
nitpicky question about that?
Yeah.
about that paragraph there. So in that where they're talking about the experience of the hybrid grading, they have a statement where students vehemently disliked having a mixture of courses. And the only quote that they offered for this was like, it felt really scary and unbalanced, only 3 to 4. And there's one quote, and I was just like, I don't know, the vehemently disliked seemed very,
Biased.
like, very, yeah. Seemed
Yeah.
like, okay, you put your own interpretation on that. And maybe that's true, but I would have liked to see a little bit more of like some quotes and things to help sort of justify that strong language, because I'm pretty sure in my qualitative research course, we were taught not to use language like that in our description. We were taught to let the quotes speak for themselves. But
Yeah.
I'm curious, again, it's nitpicky. I know it is, but
No, that's neat. It makes me think of what Catherine talked about, big D versus little d discourse. Like, I wonder if this was the person listening to this transcript and hearing the inflection
yeah,
and that sort of thing and getting that, oh, like, oh, they hated that.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That definitely could have been the case. But if that were the case, they probably needed, not probably, they needed to explain it a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's one thing to say that they vehemently did it. It's another thing for a quote to come in and be like, one of the students said, I vehemently hated it.
Yeah,
That's very different. And so, yeah, it would have been nice to have a little bit more clarification around that.
yeah. And if they had said that and then gave me a quote, was like, I absolutely hated this. I'm like,
Right.
all right, I'm with you on that. That's fair. But the quote that was used was like, it felt really scary. I'm like, and unbound, that seemed pretty mild, like, in my mind. Like, so for my interpretation of that single quote, and I'm thinking, if you're going to say students vehemently disliked it, I don't know, maybe there was some swearing that they didn't want to include. I don't know. But I wanted a quote that matched that a little bit more, or again, some sort of explanation for why those adjectives were used. Anyway, so again, nitpicky, but
it's
worth talking
an
about.
interesting thought. There have been a few times where I'm doing the qualitative analysis and I'm like, man, I get the distinct impression of this thing.
Mhm.
And then I go and try to find a good quote example of that thing. I'm like, God, I can't grab the quote that really gives me the feeling that I'm getting reading this.
Yeah.
Right. And so then my question is, do you then go back and say, where did that come from? Maybe I'm over interpreting, or do you
Oh,
say
yeah.
like, there just isn't a quote? Like, how do you reconcile that? Because sometimes you do get a feeling, and I get what you're saying, Eric. You're like, I want to capture that feeling, but you're like, was that because it was through my own lens? And now that I go back and look at it, or maybe that's where I need to go back and listen to it. And maybe there's something not just on the transcript, but there's something else. There was a pregnant pause. There was, whatever it is. But we can try to describe that, I think, when we're talking about we don't just have to use quotes. We can talk about, I think, a little bit more of the big D discourse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Didn't want to derail it, but I wanted to bring that
No,
up.
it's fine. It's good. This is why we're here. Prioritization of study time, intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, more or less reinforces what we would suspect, which is that the intrinsic motivation that they're interested in is in conflict with the extrinsic motivation of the transcript that gives them the grade. Yeah, that's kind of consistent with what you'd expect.
Yeah. And like this one, I liked the way they wrote this. These responses highlight a tension between students' intrinsic motivation to spend time. Like, I thought that was a nice, like, summary statement that wasn't overly interpretive, but just like, here, I'm summarizing what was happening. So like for me, compared to the previous section, like I felt like that was just a less biased way of kind of summarizing things. I don't know. I like that one.
And then impacts on student well-being. This quote, people just seemed a little more laid back, which was a refreshing change. Not surprisingly, they felt that it decreased their stress, which again is a consistent finding with all of these studies that have looked at transition to pass-fail. And then they also mentioned the decrease in competition in terms of improving well-being for the class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's also, maybe you're getting ready to say this, but it's important to point out in this paper that the students actually petitioned the faculty and the administration to go to full pass fail, which I thought was really interesting and good, because the students recognized the value of it and that it did increase their well-being and decrease, the antagonism and things like that. So, and that the faculty and administration responded to that by doing it, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah. I think that's really cool, especially because like in this last section, right? Like that's the big worry, like, oh, they're not going to be competitive for internships
Right.
and residencies. Well, if the students are the ones that potentially are going to be harmed by that, one, there's not good evidence to support that. And two, they're the ones that are saying, hey, this is important to us, like that the trade-off is worth it, even if that were a risk, which again, probably not. So yeah, I think that's the last little theme, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it also
And
supports their findings.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
yeah. Um, and so yeah, so competition for merit-based opportunities, including internship and residencies. I think, you know, I focus on this, that the recent survey of 572 internship residency program directors indicate most important were letters of reference, interview, cover letter, CV.
Yeah.
And this just kills me because I see students pissing me off in the classroom to get an A. And I'm like, you are doing the wrong thing, my
Yes.
man.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, that's so interesting. And it's so true because I try to tell students, listen, you start building your professional reputation the day you step into that classroom. And
Yeah.
everything you do and everything you say and every interaction you have builds or does not build that reputation. And, you know, there are 115,000 veterinarians in the United States. That seems like a lot, but when there's 340 million people in the United States, that's not a lot. And it gets even smaller when you want to specialize and you want to go into whatever. And it's still small if you want to be in GP. I mean, you know, and I think students don't really start to take me seriously until they step in it and realize I should not have stepped in it, you know? Like,
I love that example, Eric. And I almost feel like you need to make that explicit. Be like, all right,
yeah,
you think this grade is really important, but here's the things that are most important for like when you're going to get a job later. They're not going to ask me, did he get
Oh yeah, no, I've
a
told
90?
them that.
Yeah.
I've told them that day one. I'm like,
yeah,
here's the research, you guys. Focus
Yeah.
on this stuff. Do they
yeah.
listen? No.
And it's not like we're asking you to kiss our asses. We don't want you
Oh
to kiss
God,
our
no, I don't want
butts.
that either. Like,
We
God.
want you to do your work and we want you to be, you
Yeah.
know, curious and ask
Yep.
questions and
Ask
take
for help when
feedback
you need
well.
it.
And that's what we want. We want you to be a like normal human being
Yeah.
who's curious about the world, you
And
know?
I actually think a lot of the students, I do see, and I think some of this is the pass fail, right? Is I do see students asking questions, hey, can you help me understand why I got this
Mhm.
right? And so on and
Good.
so forth. And they don't mention anything about a grade. Now, oftentimes, if I, get a little more information, I go, oh yeah, that's a really good point. I can adjust your grade for this.
Yeah.
Like I'll
Yeah.
volunteer that because if I think they've made a good point. And then other times they come through and I'm like, they might be, needling to be like, oh, I was like, oh, yep, I see where you are. Do you see where you went wrong here? Yeah, okay, great. So hopefully you learn from that, and next time that, you'll be fine. And I
Yeah.
just try to like make light of it, and they're like, okay, yeah, thanks for that. So even the ones that I think might be angling for like, hey, can I get points back on this? Like I'm just like, oh, make it really positive. Cool, this was a good learning experience. But
Yeah.
I do think there's less of a can I get point, like they're not coming at me
Yeah.
initially with the can I get points back, either because they're not that's not the most important thing, or they've learned that I can't open with this. And maybe
Yeah.
I'll get lucky and I'll get the grade. But like as soon as you come at me, I want the point. Now my instinct is I don't want to give it to you, even
Right.
if because I'm like you, Eric. I'm like, oh, okay. If you come at me and say, hey, I don't understand why I got this wrong, and then I go through and I go, oh, well, you did it right, and that's fine. Here, let me fix that, right?
Mhm.
No big deal. But if you come at me at like, I need points back, I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm annoyed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's probably part of the hidden curriculum of being a professional, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it is.
for sure.
True.
And then the last one was student recommendation for implementation. I thought this was a good note, that the transition was a sufficiently large paradigm shift that it might have produced additional stress. And this is what I found doing the specifications grading class, is that on the one hand, it was good in that they didn't have to stress about the grade, but the change to that was like, we don't know what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
uncertainty is bad.
And I deal with this in my third year course every year because it's not that dramatic, but like they just took their midterm and there's a bunch of short answer and essay questions, and that's new to them. And I try to emphasize and I try to prepare them, and I'm like, here's some sample questions. Here's an example of my rubric. So you can see like, here's how I'm grading these questions. It's not what's the right answer. It's what's your justification. Like, so I'm trying to provide them the evidence, and I go, and here's the assignments and how these are preparing you for that. But it's still, and I acknowledge it. I'm like, I know this is different, and I know that in itself causes some stress, but like by the time you get through the whole course, it'll start to feel better. So like hang in there with me, but it is
Yeah.
every year. And every year I get feedback, you know, and there's some students who are like, yeah, I hated that, you know, like I hated these essay things. This is just not work. And I'm like, yeah, that's okay. But it's not a huge proportion, but it is,
Yeah.
it's scary for them every time.
Well, you know, when I was teaching, most of my teaching took place when I was teaching MPH students, and it was very similar in many ways, right? They would come into my classroom, which is an introductory level course they have to take in the first or second semester of their 2-year program, which goes by like that. But I always joke that they really didn't like me in the first probably 2 or 3 weeks, and then they realized, oh, maybe this isn't so bad. But I had to train them. I mean, for the first 4 to 5 weeks of the semester, I had to train them to understand that when I ask a question, I'm going to wait until somebody answers it because I'm not going to jump in and answer the question for you. When I tell you you need to do your reading ahead of time because we're going to do an activity that's going to involve all of the information that you're supposed to have gotten out of that, you need to have done that. And at some point, I had to implement sort of like these little knowledge check pop quizzes because I was recognizing that people weren't really doing the reading that they needed to do. But even then, it was like a 5-point quiz, you know, and it was just like, I just need to make sure that you got some of the basic information because that's how I can build on getting you, you know, there. But yeah, it took me every semester. I hated the first part of the semester because it was probably a good 3 to 5 weeks before the students were like, they would click and they're like, oh yeah, she really does want us to answer, or oh yeah, she really
Yeah.
does want us to, you know, do
Yeah.
that.
I
That
I
thing
tell the
she told us
students during
explicitly she did.
orientation, sorry, go ahead, Bobby.
No, nope, nope, you're good.
I tell the students during orientation for their clinical rotation, I can stand awkward silence way longer than you
Yep,
can.
I would say the same thing. Yeah.
Oh, you know the worst part? I can't. Like, oh,
Oh,
I wish
see,
I could.
I totally can. I mean, I can sit there and wait. I'll wait for, I mean, I'm just sitting there staring and smiling and like, this is, I
No,
don't
I
keep
was the
talking, so.
student who was like, I'll answer anything, just please make it
There's
stop. And
usually one of them. Yeah.
oh, this is like one of my struggles as an instructor is just waiting. I'm like, how long? Oh, it's only been 4 seconds. What is going on? This is I am not like you two. It's
That's okay.
painful for me. I mean, I
Yeah.
know that and I can force myself to do it, but nope, I will lose that battle every
That's
time.
hilarious.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so then yeah, they don't really have a discussion section. They go right to conclusions, which is fine, and it's
Yeah.
pretty much what we've already talked about. In terms of limitations, obviously a single institution and transition from letting grading to MPF, which is different than like a straight, you know, pass fail during the pandemic. So there's a lot of, you know, confounding variables here. Um, and they mentioned their experiences of their students may be different from others. Um, but I don't know, like it in terms of like face validity, which I realize is a bad type of validity, like it works. You know, it's
Yeah.
like, oh no, like I think that if we had done this same thing at my institution and then surveyed them, we would have very similar results.
Yeah.
Difficult to know, you know, without doing that, but it feels true, which I don't know if that's bad or not when I'm reading a study.
No, I don't think that's bad. I mean, I think that's part of the reason that you want a little bit more information so that you can replicate it in a way that makes sense. And then you can say, oh, yeah, my gut instinct was right. Or wow, I was way off. You know, I mean, I think that's part of why we're sort of harping on some of the details that weren't included in this particular study. But I will say that I really was happy to see it. And I was glad that somebody published something that was researchy about it, because I think there is lots of angst about modified pass fail or pass fail, whatever you want to call it. I know, again, at Virginia, Maryland, one of the reasons they didn't go full pass fail was because of that. Like, oh, what are we going to do with our students who want to go do internships and residencies? And they provided a dean's letter, which, you know, was in place of that. And that was their justification at Virginia, Maryland, was like, well, we need to have a class rank. But frankly, it's a lot of work for no real good reason. And it's like, sort of the antithesis of everything that pass fail is supposed to be when you're naming a class valedictorian. It's like, well, that doesn't really make any sense to me, you know, and it doesn't decrease the grade grubbing, and it doesn't decrease the stress, and it doesn't decrease, you know, because they all know in the back of their mind, oh, I'm just going to get a pass or a fail on my transcript. But really, I need to get a 92% or my class rank is going to go down and I'm not going to get my internship or whatever. So I appreciated that they went all in on it. And that they, allowed the students to have a say and actually influence the outcome of the program. I think that's really empowering for students.
Yep. That was one of the other things I really liked about this study is they focused on the student's perspective. They didn't try to get fancy and say, and we're also going to hear from the faculty and we're going to,
Yeah.
they were like, nope, we just want your perspective. That's enough for this paper. And so I did really like that. And the other thing, I think getting back to kind of what you were saying earlier, Eric, about like, how do you apply this to something else? And I mean, I think we have to, with qualitative research, anytime we do that, we have to recognize, okay, this is the context, and they provided the context for us, which is what they have to do. Here's our context. There was a pandemic going on. We made these changes for these reasons, and we changed them back. They provided that context, which means we do have to take that with a grain of salt. Can I directly apply this to another scenario? No, the context will be different. But that doesn't mean I can't glean some information. I can't reinforce maybe some expectancy value theory when it comes to motivation. It doesn't mean I can't, so I do think it is still incredibly valuable. And I think overall this was well done. I mean, we were nitpicky about the paper, right? But I think overall this was really useful. And as you said, hopefully, maybe the next school that wants to do that, or if Virginia, Maryland wants to go that next step. Yeah, I would love that. Oh no, we lost all the rankings. Nobody cares. Because I think that's the other thing that's really powerful is the lack of impact. It's not like, oh, nobody from NC State ever got internships or residencies.
Right.
Come on.
Right. They've actually published papers saying that they've not lost any kind of momentum with their students.
Exactly. So I think the arguments that remain are dwindling in their impact. So hopefully we're seeing more of this.
I agree. I liked it. Thought it was good data, good conclusions. And especially I appreciated their initiative to capture a moment in time, where it's like you need to set this study up to be done in that moment as much as possible. And that requires some pretty cool vision, to recognize that opportunity and to jump on it.
And not look back like, remember 2 years ago when we did this? What did you do?
Right.
No, that's a really good point, because how often do we do that? Oh, we should have done a survey.
Not often enough.
Exactly.
And that might have been, to be fair, this may have been a little rushed because of that, right? They didn't have a lot. So I could totally see that's why we didn't go through all the steps for the survey. I wish they'd said that though. We were feeling a little rushed. They did have a nice comment when I remember they were talking about, we had this many students who volunteered for the interviews. We only could do 7 because of scheduling and this, that. So I do think those acknowledgements are helpful. Hey, we get it.
Yes.
We tried, we would have liked to talk to all of them, but we couldn't because of X, Y, and Z. A little more of that, I think, would have been helpful just for that context. But overall, I think they did a really nice job here.
Yeah. Agreed.
Cool.
Good article, Eric.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey, great. Thanks for the discussion. That was really fun.
Yeah, that was a good one. Cool. Well, I think that's probably all we have. And so we'll see everybody next time.
Yeah.